Charles River Dam. This would be our 100-year flood event around the mid-century, and we could see this every year or multiple times a decade around the end of the century. Again, this is a very, very different city if we do nothing. This kind of flooding starts to really affect our commerce. This is Logan Airport, 6 feet above high tide. Connolly Terminal, where our cargo comes in. Downtown Wharves, there's the aquarium. East Boston and South Boston. So what do we do with this knowledge? And again, I want to thank New York City for taking one for the team, because although we really missed the worst of it, it sure did accelerate our planning. The city of Boston, again, that leadership was terrific, and we hope that the new mayor is equally as motivated. They just released a report called Climate Ready Boston with what they've done in the last year. So they have finished a vulnerability assessment of the municipal infrastructure, not private property, but city property. They're preparing guidelines based on best practices for new developments for climate change adaptation. Again, not just flooding, but also heat waves. They're developing a wetlands ordinance. We've never had one before. They distributed homeowner flood protection information. And finally, next year's third climate action plan will focus on climate change preparedness, and that's being developed right now. But this is too big of a problem for just the government, just any level of government. We also need to have considerable private sector actions. Every building in that flood zone needs to develop vulnerability assessments and time-phased preparedness plans and incorporate these plans into regular maintenance schedules. We are lucky in the city of Boston that predominantly our issue is sea level rise because we have such a protective harbor. The towns around, outside the harbor are really focused on emergency preparedness short term. But we have the opportunity to really enhance our infrastructure and private property over time in a bit more predictable way. And then if you have a bill, as many people learned in New York and New Jersey, even if your building is fine but you have no power, you cannot use it. So we need to work between private property and the utilities and public agencies to make sure that the public realm is also prepared. So I'm going to pick on the T for a moment. This is the Marriott Hotel on Long Wharf, right there. That to the MBTA. That arrow is the Aquarium T Station. This is what a very dense time-phased preparedness plan looks like. I'm going to walk through it. You don't need to absorb this. All of this is available for free on our website, Boston Harbor Association. So the thing that is very counterintuitive is as you go down, flooding goes up. So 4 feet is about or 0 is about mid-tide. So down here is 16 feet above mid-tide. This is how high tide changes over time from today to the turn of the century. This is how our annual flood increases over time from today to end of the century. This is our 100-year flood. So here's the poor T station sitting at 7.5 feet above mid-tide. So, and over here you basically say, am I worried? The green is you're good to go for now. Orange is you can do something at a building level. Yellow is you need to do something at a neighborhood level. Red is you can no longer protect your building from flooding. You need to either move up a floor or inland. So what can you learn from a dense preparedness plan like this? First is you can say, what do I have to worry about today? So for the Aquarium T stop, today, high tide does not affect the T. Today's annual flood does hit the T. And if you noticed in the photo before, they did have some sandbags getting ready for Nemo. But the T is already vulnerable to our 100-year flood. So that's to notice. A 100-year flood doesn't come very often. You could put sandbags around the station. But if that station floods, that's the blue line that cuts off the whole North Shore from the rest of the subway station. The other question you have that you can answer with a time-phased preparedness plan is, when do I have to worry? So here's our annual flood. Again, today, not such a big deal. By mid-century, every year, the T's going to have to deal with 1.5 feet of seawater. By the end of the century, it's dealing more with 5 feet of seawater. There's an elevator right there. You go into the T, there's a very small foyer, a very long escalator, and then you're right in the T. Very difficult to manage 5 feet of water. So the general manager of the T says, aha, in my next capital improvements budget, I need to move that station. There's no use in elevating it, because at some point it's going to actually be inundated. So one thing the Boston Harbor Association has been really thinking about is this idea of living with water. People have mentioned doing giant sea dams across our Boston Harbor islands. Don't know what that would do for all the money we spent on the cleanup, for one. But it also would sap all of our money to do anything else. So we're saying, if you can't dam the water, what do you do with that water? You can't keep back the tide. How do you live with the tide? So some of the ideas are favoring resilience, meaning how quickly can you come back from flooding, as opposed to keeping that water out. Part of that is elevating vulnerable resources, whether it's our electrical grid or the Museum of Fine Arts basement, or rugs versus tile. How do you elevate resources that would be damaged by salt water, and pairing that with areas that can flood without damage? And finally, how do we incorporate flood control into the livability and vibrancy of our city? Some of the examples are right here in Boston. Spalding Rehab has become a poster child of excellent adaptive design. So they are right out, they call it World's End, at the end of the Charlestown Navy Yard, which is a very floodable area. They got caught in the credit crunch in the Great Recession, and they could not build this building until they could get credit. So they decided to learn from Katrina about flood control. So one of the things they did was they kept critical patient programs off the first floor. That's all conference rooms and a cafe. Their windows open if their generators fail. That was one concern where the New Orleans hospitals got to be over 100 degrees in the summer. Their electrical equipment and other services are on the roof. And none of their critical floors are below the high estimate for the 100-year flood almost 100 years from now. So they're good to go for a while. Plus their landscaping is also very floodable. Other ideas that I think will be really relevant for Boston when we're looking at this much flooding. So Seoul, South Korea, they had a big dig project like this, like we did. This is their big dig. They had an elevated highway over a capped canal. It smelled, it was dark, it was noisy, similar to our Southeast Expressway. It really depressed the neighborhood. Instead of building an at-grade greenway as we have, they went below grade. This water actually has to be piped in. It would normally be dry, but they've created this beautiful, beautiful social space. This is during their dry season. They have torrential summer rains that had been a real flooding problem. But the Chungachung Channel is like our Newbury Street, or the Seine. It's beautiful. It's full of lights at night. It's become a social center of the city. This is what it looks like during the rainy season. You can see the cars are still on the ground. It's protecting the infrastructure and the buildings around it. Similarly, their Han River, like our Charles River, on both sides they've created green space. On one side, playing fields, on another side, a natural area. That's the dry season. That's the wet season. If you look closely, the equivalent of their Storer Drive and Memorial Drive, they're still going. This is this idea of living with water, not wading through water, but channeling it where you want to go so that you can allow it into your cities without damage. So we've been talking about this idea of a sapphire necklace of canals to go with our emerald necklace of parks. Some other ideas from around the world. This is a floating recreation center, I think in Rotterdam. It's 8 acres, obviously a temporary building, but fantastic. Not going to flood if it's floating. This is in English called a sand motor. They dredged and dumped a tremendous amount of sand, which really dampens the storm force. Currents and storms redistribute the sand along the coastline and protect more vulnerable areas behind it. This is a beautiful harbor walk in Spain. Look how it really mimics coastal area. There's a jogging path below that brown is wood, and it's both a tremendous public asset, but you can also imagine how it could channel water into canals or storm drains behind it, protecting the infrastructure behind. So you create a tremendous social space as well as coastal flood management. And finally, this is the GCANS project in Tokyo. It is an underground area that drains the city. They make movies in here. It's a tourist attraction. So this is what it looks like when it's dry. It's fantastic. This is called the Underground Cathedral, and yet it is great flood control. So if you remember only 3 things from this presentation for Boston, today's 100-year flood could well be mid-century's annual flood and 2100's high tide. Property owners must develop time-phased preparedness plans to meet the increased coastal flooding over time. And policymakers need to work with property owners to help overcome the technical or financial barriers they need to protect their own buildings, and then help when private action is insufficient, such as in the public realm. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here and honored to speak